World War II ended in 1945. It was a long and terrible war. The Axis powers were Germany, Italy, and Japan. They were defeated. The Allied powers won the war. These included the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. France and China were also key allies. This outcome created the world we know today. The cost of the war was very high. Millions of people lost their lives. Many cities were destroyed. The world was changed forever by this great conflict. Germany surrendered to the Allies in May 1945. Adolf Hitler, the German leader, was dead. His Nazi regime had collapsed completely. Europe was free from Nazi tyranny. But the continent faced a long road to recovery. It had to rebuild its cities and its societies. Europe was also divided. The West, led by America, and the East, led by the Soviet Union, began to face each other. This division was the beginning of the Cold War. A new kind of tension settled over the land. In Asia, the war continued for a few more months. Japan finally surrendered in August 1945. This happened after the United States dropped atomic bombs. The cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were devastated. Japan's Emperor Hirohito announced the surrender to his people. This marked the end of Japan's military expansion. For Japan and for Asia, it was the start of a new, uncertain era. The fighting was over. The rebuilding had to begin. The end of World War II brought big changes. The United Nations was formed. Its main goal was to prevent future world wars. It aimed to foster peace and cooperation. However, the war also gave rise to the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union became global superpowers. They had very different ideas about how the world should be run. Their rivalry would shape global politics for many decades. The world had traded one great conflict for a long, simmering one. The course of World War II could have been very different. Several key moments, especially in the early years, held the potential to alter the outcome dramatically. One such moment was the Battle of Dunkirk in May and June of 1940. Hundreds of thousands of British and French soldiers were trapped by the German army. A heroic evacuation effort, using many small boats, saved most of them. If these soldiers had been captured, Britain's ability to continue the fight would have been severely weakened. Its defences would be crippled. Another critical early event was the Battle of Britain. This took place in the summer and fall of 1940. Germany launched a massive air campaign. They wanted to destroy Britain's Royal Air Force. This would pave the way for a sea invasion. The RAF pilots, though outnumbered, fought with great courage and skill. They successfully defended their homeland. If Germany had achieved air superiority, an invasion of Britain might have succeeded. This would have been a devastating blow to the Allied cause. Britain was a bastion of resistance. Adolf Hitler made a fateful decision in June 1941. He ordered the invasion of the Soviet Union. This was codenamed Operation Barbarossa. It opened a vast and brutal new front in the east. This decision stretched German military resources very thin. Germany now fought on two major fronts. What if Hitler had chosen a different strategy? Perhaps he could have focused all his might on defeating Britain. Or he might have tried to secure North Africa and the Mediterranean first. The war could have taken a completely different turn. The entry of the United States into the war was also a major turning point. Japan attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in December 1941. This surprise attack brought the full industrial might of the USA into the conflict on the Allied side. Without American factories, resources, and soldiers, the Allies would have faced a much more difficult struggle. America's involvement tipped the scales significantly. It provided a massive boost to the war effort against the Axis powers. The sleeping giant had awakened. The Eastern Front was a theatre of unimaginable scale and savagery. The fighting between Germany and the Soviet Union was brutal. Millions of soldiers and civilians perished there. The Battle of Moscow in the winter of 1941 to 1942 was a crucial moment. The German army, hoping for a quick victory, reached the outskirts of the Soviet capital. But the Red Army, aided by the harsh Russian winter, managed to halt the German advance. If Moscow had fallen, Soviet morale might have shattered. The Soviet Union could have lost vital industrial areas and access to oil. The Battle of Stalingrad, fought from late 1942 to early 1943, was another decisive turning point. The German Sixth Army pushed deep into the city. After months of ferocious street fighting, Soviet forces counterattacked. They encircled and eventually destroyed the entire German army at Stalingrad. This was a catastrophic defeat for Hitler. It marked the beginning of Germany's retreat on the Eastern Front. If Germany had captured Stalingrad, they might have secured the rich oil fields of the Caucasus. This would have provided crucial fuel for their war machine. The resilience of the Soviet people and their government was remarkable. Facing invasion, they managed to relocate entire factories. They moved them hundreds of miles east, beyond the reach of German bombers. They mobilized their whole population for the war effort. This was known as the Great Patriotic War. What if this internal strength had faltered? Perhaps due to more effective German propaganda or deeper initial military successes. The Soviet Union might have been forced to seek a separate peace, or it could have collapsed under the strain. A different outcome on the Eastern Front would have had profound consequences for the entire war. If the Soviet Union had been defeated or had collapsed, Germany would have been free. They could have transferred millions of troops and vast amounts of equipment to the Western Front. This would have made an Allied invasion of France, like D-Day, much more difficult, perhaps impossible. The war in Europe could have dragged on for many more years, or it might have ended with a German victory on the continent. The world would be very different. The war in the Pacific Ocean also had its own critical turning points. Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, was a bold gamble. The aim was to disable the United States Pacific Fleet. This would give Japan time to establish its dominance in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. While damaging, the attack was not a complete success. The American aircraft carriers, by chance, were at sea that day and escaped destruction. If those carriers had been sunk, America's ability to strike back quickly would have been severely hampered. The war in the Pacific might have started very differently. The Battle of Midway, fought in June 1942, was a truly decisive naval engagement. The United States Navy, using intelligence gained from breaking Japanese codes, ambushed the Japanese fleet. American dive bombers sank 4 of Japan's best aircraft carriers in a matter of minutes. This was a devastating blow to Japanese naval air power. It effectively halted Japan's eastward expansion in the Pacific. If Japan had won at Midway, they could have threatened Hawaii again. They might have even attempted an invasion, or they could have sought a negotiated peace from a position of strength. Japan's strategic decisions also played a significant role in the Pacific War's course. The Japanese military leadership chose to spread their forces widely. They were fighting major campaigns in China. They invaded and occupied large parts of Southeast Asia. They also pushed across the vast Pacific Ocean. What if they had adopted a more concentrated strategy? Perhaps they could have focused on completely securing vital resources in areas like the Dutch East Indies. Or they might have tried to deliver a knockout blow against China before turning their full attention to the United States. A different outcome in the Pacific War would have meant Japanese domination over a huge area. They aimed to establish what they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. This would have been an empire controlling the resources and populations of many Asian nations. Countries like Australia, New Zealand, and India would have faced a direct and serious threat. The global balance of power would have shifted dramatically. A victorious Japan would have become a major world power, shaping Asia's destiny for generations under its imperial rule. This would have changed the face of the modern world. Section 5: Axis Innovations and Allied Delays, the technology race. Technology was a critical factor in World War II. All sides raced to develop new and more effective weapons. Germany was at the forefront of several technological innovations. They developed the first operational jet fighter, the Messerschmitt Me-262. They also created the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 ballistic rocket. These were advanced weapons for their time. What if these German wonder weapons had been developed and deployed earlier in the war, and in much larger numbers? They could have significantly altered the air war over Europe. They might have even changed the course of key battles. The Allied development of the atomic bomb was a top-secret undertaking known as the Manhattan Project. It was an enormous scientific and industrial effort. It was also a race against time, driven by the fear that Nazi Germany might develop such a weapon first. Germany did have its own nuclear research program, but it was smaller and less successful. What if the Allied atomic bomb project had faced major setbacks or significant delays? Or even more chilling, what if Germany had succeeded in building an atomic bomb before the Allies? The end of the war and the world that followed would be almost unimaginable. Code breaking played a secret but hugely important role in the Allied victory. Allied intelligence, particularly British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, succeeded in breaking Germany's sophisticated Enigma codes. They also broke high-level Japanese codes. This intelligence, known as Ultra and Magic, gave the Allies vital information. It helped them anticipate enemy movements and strategies. This was crucial in the Battle of the Atlantic against German U-boats. It was also vital for the D-Day landings. What if these codes had remained unbroken? The war would have been much harder and longer for the Allies. Delays in major Allied offensives could also have altered the war's timeline and outcome. For example, the D-Day landings in Normandy in June 1944 were a massive and complex operation. What if these landings had been postponed for a significant period? Or worse, what if they had failed? This would have given Germany more time. They could have strengthened their coastal defenses further. They could have deployed more of their new weapons. A delay or failure at D-Day would have prolonged the war in Europe considerably. The human cost would have been even greater. The Soviet Union might have advanced further west. Section 6. A world redrawn geopolitical shifts under alternate victories. An Axis victory or even a negotiated peace favourable to Germany and Japan would have completely redrawn the world map. If Germany had achieved dominance over continental Europe, a vast Nazi empire could have emerged. This empire might have stretched from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the Ural Mountains in the east. Such an outcome would have meant a dark age for countless millions. Freedom, democracy, and human rights would have been systematically suppressed. The persecution of Jews and other minorities would have continued and expanded across the continent. Resistance would be met with brutal force. If Japan had been victorious in Asia and the Pacific, it would have established its Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. This would have been an empire controlling the vast natural resources and populations of East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands. Local peoples would have suffered under harsh Japanese military rule and economic exploitation. Their cultures and languages might have been suppressed in favor of Japanese ones. The dream of independence for many Asian nations would have been crushed, or it would have been twisted into a form of subservience to Japanese imperial ambitions. The Pacific would be a Japanese lake. What would have happened to the major Allied powers in such scenarios? If Great Britain had been defeated or forced to sue for peace, the United States might have found itself facing a hostile, Axis-dominated world largely alone. Or America might have retreated into isolationism, trying to defend the Western Hemisphere. The ideals of democracy and individual liberty would have been under severe threat globally. The world map would look unrecognizable to us today. Spheres of influence would be carved out by Germany and Japan, not by the Allies. A new global order based on authoritarianism would prevail. The Soviet Union's fate would also be critical. Even in scenarios where the Western Allies faced setbacks, the Eastern Front was paramount. If the Soviet Union collapsed, Germany's power would be immense. Conversely, if the Western Allies were significantly weaker or their offensives delayed, Stalin's Soviet Union might have pushed much deeper into Europe. More countries in Central and even Western Europe could have fallen under communist control. The Iron Curtain, which Churchill spoke of, might have been drawn much further to the west. This would have created an even more intense and dangerous Cold War dynamic. Section 7. Societies transformed, living in a different post-war era. The societal impacts of an alternative World War II outcome would have been profound and far-reaching. If Nazi Germany had triumphed, its abhorrent racial ideologies would have been imposed across its vast domain. The systematic persecution and extermination of Jews, Slavs, Roma, and other groups deemed inferior would have continued and expanded. Brave resistance movements might have fought on in secret. But for most people living under Nazi rule, life would be characterized by constant fear, suspicion, and oppression. Education, art, and culture would become mere tools of state propaganda. In a Japanese-dominated Asia, societies would have faced similar forms of oppression and control. Japanese imperial authorities would likely have imposed their language and culture on conquered populations. Local traditions and national identities would have been suppressed. The economic resources of occupied territories would be ruthlessly exploited for Japan's benefit. The concept of Asia for the Asiatics promoted by Japan would in reality mean Asia for the Japanese. Resistance to Japanese rule would be met with extreme brutality. The lives of ordinary people would be filled with hardship and servitude. Even in scenarios that did not involve a complete Axis victory, significant societal changes would have occurred. A longer, more destructive war would have meant even greater loss of life. More cities would be turned to rubble. Societies across the globe would be more deeply exhausted, both physically and psychologically. The process of recovery and rebuilding would take much longer. The collective trauma could lead to different social and political movements. Perhaps more radical ideologies would gain traction, or a deeper sense of pessimism might pervade the post-war generation. Global migration patterns would also be dramatically altered. Vast numbers of refugees would be displaced. They would flee from oppressive regimes, from ongoing conflicts, or from areas suffering from famine and disease. The development of international law, particularly concerning human rights and the conduct of war, might have been severely stunted. Or, paradoxically, it might have emerged differently, forged in the crucible of even greater suffering and injustice. The world we know today, with its specific social norms and cultural exchanges, would be almost unrecognizable. It would be an alien landscape. Section 8. Echoes in the present, legacies of what might have been. The world we live in today is a direct consequence of the actual outcome of World War II. The establishment of the United Nations was a key result. It aimed to provide a forum for nations to resolve disputes peacefully. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, proclaimed in 1948, was another landmark. It set out fundamental freedoms for all people. The war also accelerated decolonization movements. Many nations in Asia and Africa gained independence in the post-war decades. All these developments were profoundly influenced by the Allied victory and the desire to prevent another global catastrophe. If the Axis powers had won, or if the war had ended in a stalemate that favored them, these positive developments might never have occurred, or they would have taken vastly different forms. We might be living in a world dominated by powerful authoritarian empires. Democracy and individual rights might be considered radical or dangerous ideas, suppressed in many parts of the globe. Technological development might also have followed different paths. Perhaps it would be even more focused on military applications and tools of social control. Our daily lives would be vastly different. The Cold War, the intense rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, shaped much of the second half of the 20th century. This too was a direct consequence of the Allied victory and the subsequent division of power, particularly in Europe. If the Soviet Union had collapsed during the war, or if Nazi Germany had remained a dominant power in Europe, the Cold War as we knew it would not have happened. Instead, different global tensions would have emerged, perhaps a bitter rivalry between a victorious Germany and Japan, or a confrontation between a dominant Germany and a more isolated United States. Our current understanding of concepts like nationalism, sovereignty, and international cooperation is deeply rooted in the lessons learned from World War II. An alternative ending to the war would mean a different set of historical lessons, or perhaps crucial lessons would not have been learned at all. The struggles for freedom, self-determination, and human dignity would undoubtedly continue, but they would take on new forms against different kinds of oppressors. The moral and political landscape of our present day would be fundamentally altered. We would look back on a very different 20th century. Section 9. Conclusion: the unwritten chapters of history. History is not a fixed path. It is not predetermined. It is constantly being shaped by human decisions, by chance occurrences, and by unforeseen events. Many key moments during World War II hung precariously in the balance. A different choice made by a leader, a different outcome in a crucial battle, a technological breakthrough achieved sooner or later. Any of these could have sent history cascading down a vastly different path. We study these what-if scenarios not to dwell on fear or regret. We do it to better understand the immense stakes that were involved. The actual end of World War II was devastating for millions. The human cost was staggering. The physical destruction was immense. But that ending also paved the way for efforts to build a more peaceful and just world, however imperfectly. When we imagine alternative outcomes, it highlights the profound value of what was fought for by the Allies. Ideals like freedom, human dignity, and the right of nations to choose their own destiny were genuinely at risk. These principles were defended at a terrible price. Their survival was not guaranteed. The world we inhabit today, with its institutions, its borders, and its international norms, bears the deep and indelible imprint of those war years. The sacrifices made by an entire generation, the unimaginable horrors that were endured by so many. Contemplating what-if scenarios serves as a powerful reminder of the fragility of peace and stability. It shows how easily progress can be reversed, and it underscores how important it is to remain vigilant in defending democratic values and human rights. These are not to be taken for granted. The unwritten chapters of World War II are a sobering and thought-provoking subject. They force us to confront the immense human cost of conflict. They also reveal the complex and often unpredictable web of cause and effect that shapes our world. By exploring these alternate historical paths, these roads not taken, we gain a deeper and more nuanced appreciation for the path that history actually followed. And we can better understand the world that ultimately emerged from the ashes of that global conflagration. It is a world built on the lessons of its most destructive war.